Well, welcome everyone. My name is Cristen Incitti, and I'm the Executive Director of Habitat for Humanity of Minnesota. Habitat for Humanity of Minnesota is an affiliate support organization that advances and advocates for the work of 28 Habitat affiliates in Minnesota. Our key services include lending and grant programs, training and technical assistance, and public policy and advocacy efforts at the state and local levels. We see the power and energy in convening leaders in our state to elevate affordable homeownership as an equity issue and a strategy for building strong, thriving communities, which is why we are thrilled so many of you have taken the time to join us today for our first ever World Habitat Day event, the Equity in Homeownership panel discussion. We have a dynamic group of speakers today, and I'm looking forward to the dialogue. As we begin today, I'd like to thank the Minnesota Homeownership Center team for their partnership in planning and coordinating the event. We're thankful to continue our collaboration in advancing and elevating affordable homeownership in our state. Julie Guggen, president of the Homeownership Center, is here to say a few words. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you, Kristen. Hello, everybody. I'm pleased and honored to be part of this extremely important discussion. The Minnesota Homeownership Center believes that owning a home is the foundation for success. We know that homeownership grounds families, that children of homeowners do better in school, and that owning one's home leads to stable employment and better health. And successful homeownership builds wealth. In fact, the median net worth of homeowners in our country is more than 44 times that of renters. I'm proud to be able to serve on the board of directors for Habitat for Humanity of Minnesota. The mission of our organization and Habitat Minnesota aligns well as we all collectively think about elevating the importance of homeownership and advocating for equitable access to homeownership for all Minnesotans. Thanks for having me, and I look forward to the panel discussion.
Thank you, Julie. Affordable homeownership and creating racial equity in ownership housing is why we're here today. World Habitat Day was launched 30 years ago by the United Nations to highlight the importance of this work. And we continue to see the role affordable, safe, and stable housing plays in creating strong and thriving communities. And this has been only emphasized during a global pandemic and a civil rights and racial justice movement. Our work continues, and I'm thankful for the leaders joining us today to talk about their work and what we can collectively do together to move forward in achieving this goal. One of our key partners in this work is the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency. We value their commitment to this work and are excited to share that Commissioner Jennifer Ho has provided a few comments through video today, and Assistant Commissioner Casey Keir has joined us for a few remarks as well. Kristen, can you tee up the video?
Happy World Habitat Day. I'm Jennifer Ho, the Commissioner of Minnesota Housing, and I'm glad that I can celebrate World Habitat Day with you today. Homeownership, especially homeownership opportunities for lower income families and Black, Indigenous people of color, is so important. Homeownership is the way that we create wealth and pass wealth between generations. It's a way that we ensure housing stability, strong neighborhoods, and strong communities. I'm so grateful for the partnership that Minnesota Housing has with Habitat for Humanity Minnesota and the Homeownership Opportunity Alliance and the Homeownership Center. Working together, we have been able to create homeownership opportunities for low-income families, including low-income families of color. In Minnesota, we have the fourth worst disparity in homeownership rates for communities of color. But we've learned that through counseling and down payment assistance and that extra work of just building houses priced to be affordable to people who make less, we can actually provide homeownership to families. So thank you for what you do. And I know there's a virus out there, a pandemic. It's impacting the way that we do the work. I know that we're having important conversations about how to create racial justice. And I know that you are working every day on housing justice. So thank you. Happy World.
Casey?
Thank you, Kristen. I'm honored to be a part of World Habitat Day, and thank you to Habitat for Humanity of Minnesota and to the Homeownership Center for planning this event and for your commitment and partnership in supporting equitable access to homeownership. I'm Casey Kier, Assistant Commissioner at Minnesota Housing. For almost 50 years, Minnesota Housing has helped prepare low and moderate income homeowners and Black, Indigenous, and people of color for successful homeownership through supporting homebuyer education and counseling and providing affordable mortgages and down payment and closing cost assistance to help Minnesotans achieve homeownership and build stability and wealth. Minnesota Housing also helps to preserve, improve, and make homes accessible and energy efficient through forgivable and low interest rate home improvement loans across the state. Our work is even more important now as BIPOC communities who are already disproportionately impacted through the Great Recession are now more likely to be impacted by COVID-19. We continue to help individuals and families buy homes and access down payments through the pandemic while helping struggling families by providing financial support for renters and homeowners through the COVID Housing Assistance Program. Through funding received through the CARES Act, Minnesota Housing has made available $100 million to cover overdue housing payments for eligible applicants. We've had over $30 million in requests statewide, with over $10 million in disbursements in the first month of the program to cover overdue mortgage, rent, utilities, and program costs. The program is administered by many administrators across the state, and you can find out more at mnhousing.gov. As co-lead for the Homeownership Opportunity Alliance, I'd like to thank all of the Homeownership Opportunity Alliance members for joining us on this event today, and to all of the panelists for sharing your experience and your expertise in what we can and need to do to address systemic racism and racial inequities in homeownership. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Thank you, Kristen.
Thank you, Casey, for your words, and to the Commissioner and the entire agency for your support of this work. And thank you for your leadership with the CHAP, the COVID Housing Assistance Program. Habitat Minnesota and the Homeownership Center are thankful to be part of that partnership and in providing housing assistance to Minnesotans who need it at this time. So thank you. Also, I want to echo Casey's comments about appreciation to the Homeownership Opportunity Alliance. Thank you for joining us today and supporting this work as well. Now, let's get to the panelists. That's what we're all here for, right? So we're going to spend some time with each of them and have questions prepared. And we're hoping to have time at the end for audience questions. So audience members, if you have questions, feel free to add them to the Q&A box that's available in your Zoom platform, and we'll be monitoring those. And at the end of the session, we will choose a few to answer as time allows. So please help me welcome the following four panelists. Tawanna Black, CEO and founder of the Center for Economic Inclusion. Kirsten Delegard, co-founder and co-director of the Mapping Prejudice Project. Natosha Reid Rice, Habitat for Humanity International's newly named Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer. And Henry Rucker, financial coach for Project for Pride in Living and real estate broker with Banneker Realty. We'll begin the panel with each panelist taking a few minutes to introduce themselves and sharing a bit about their work. So panelists, please share with us a bit about yourself, your organization, and what brought you or motivated you to do this work. Quick reminder to unmute yourself as we go through this, and we'll start off with Natosha Reid Rice.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you, Kristen and team, for putting together this wonderful acknowledgement and recognition of World Habitat Day. I look forward to the panel conversation and know that we'll dive deeper and deeply into this conversation of housing, of access to housing and adequate shelter, especially now as we're looking and living through this COVID-19 crisis. What we're realizing is that this is not the only pandemic that we as a country are making our way through and trying to figure our way through, but also we've got the pandemic that has been brought to the forefront on our streets, particularly in Minneapolis and many other cities around our country, of the systemic injustice that many of the communities that we actually serve through the Habitat Network and through some of our partnerships are experiencing. the continued killings and the continued injustice that we're seeing, outpouring of protests on our streets, continues to amplify the lack of equity when it comes to housing, continues to amplify the lack of equity in the wealth gap in this country, which is very much connected to the issue of housing. And I think it's important as we can enter into this conversation, and many of us are doing the work out in the field, is that we realize it didn't arrive by accident. Habitat's National Cost of Home advocacy campaign to shine a light and to encourage and equip and empower our network, both at the local, the state, and the national level, to implement policies and strategies that try to provide housing affordability throughout the country, continues to amplify that a century of housing and land use policies enacted at the local, state, and federal government denied African American households access to homeownership, access to credit. And we see that play out not only with Black Americans and Black homeowners, but also with other homeowners of color. We at Habitat realize that that's an issue. We realize that taking a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens is essential to strategy formation, to the creation of better systems that allow for there to be access to credit and access to home ownership opportunities. So there's so much work to do, so many partnerships to continue to invest in, and relationships to continue to have. So I'm looking forward to the conversation today and to working together to really transform our cities and our communities around the country.
Thank you, Natosha. Kirsten?
Hello, how are you all today? Thank you so much for having me today and letting me be part of this really important conversation. So I'm one of the co-founders of the Mapping Prejudice Project, which is located in the University of Minnesota Libraries at the John Borchard Map Library at the University of Minnesota. And what our project is doing is we're mobilizing people from all backgrounds, all ages, to come together to map racial covenants. Racial covenants were legal clauses that were inserted into property records that reserved land for the exclusive use of white people. So the language of these restrictions varies, but it was always racist. I'll read you one example. One deed from Hennepin County here in 1929 declared that no person or persons other than of the white race shall be permitted to occupy said premises or any part thereof. So why do we think this history is important? We think this history is important. Our project started with a question. Why do the Twin Cities have some of the highest racial disparities in the country? We're using history to understand this, and we're using maps to share this history and our research with the broadest audience possible. We do this work in collaboration with community members. We've invited thousands of volunteers to come in and read these property deeds, transcribe these racial covenants, and really allow us to have really robust data around how prevalent these racial restrictions were. So in Hennepin County, we found that there were 25,000 property parcels that had this kind of racist language attached to it. It's a huge swath of the county. We finished that map in 2019, and we've moved on to map Ramsey County. And all of this work, this is a long lead up for all of this work, is to try to use history to understand how we got to the now, how we got to this place where we have the highest racial disparities in the country. We know they were used in every community. And we also know they've been illegal for 50 years. But despite the fact that they have been illegal for 50 years, we're still living with the legacies of these restrictions. Because housing, as all of you know, housing sits at the foundation of all these other disparities that we've been talking about in the Twin Cities. Housing determines whether you're healthy, whether you're sick, whether you're gonna have wealth to pass on to the next generation, what kind of stability that you have. And even though these restrictions have been illegal for 50 years, we haven't done enough to really right the wrongs, to make amends for the crimes that were committed. And that's why I'm here today, to be here with all of you working with Habitat for Humanity, because that's the work that you're doing. And it's really important that we that we bring to this present day work, this knowledge of the history, and the fact that, as Natosha already said, it was deliberately created, these disparities that we have were deliberately created. So with that, I'll hand it off to the next panelist.
Thanks, Kirsten. Tawanna?
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for the welcome and the opportunity to join you today for World Habitat Day. As was said, I'm Tawanna Black, and I'm the founder and CEO of the Center for Economic Inclusion, where we work to equip public and private sector employers and policymakers with the knowledge, skills, tools, and resources to dismantle institutional racism and to catalyze new racially inclusive workplaces that also foster racial equity in economics, and to foster shared accountability across our regions by working hand in hand across sectors, but in particular by interrogating the way that we work across sectors in order to truly build an economy that works for everyone. And while we work with economic development, with workforce development, transportation, and housing, as was already shared by my colleague speakers, we know that having a home that is accessible and is affordable is truly fundamental for all of us. And yet we know that for far too long, as has been shared, housing accessibility and affordability has been out of reach for far too many, and in particular, racism has been used as a tool to keep accessible and affordable housing, and in particular, home ownership, out of the hands of people who look like me, African American, Asian, Latino, and Native American families, and that policies and laws have been used as a tool to be able to keep that out of reach. And as has been shared, laws and policies have changed, and yet we know that practices and tools continue to be put in place to keep that American dream, that American promise out of the hands of far too many. At our organization, we use tools and policies to be able to undo racism, to help leaders understand why it continues to be in place, even with the tools that have been used to undo those laws, why it continues to be used as a tool to be able to keep it out of hands, and to help us undo those mindsets that keep us thinking that some people should and shouldn't have that American dream, so that we can reshift our not only economy, but our ways of being, and really create neighborhoods, places, and communities of full racial inclusion and belonging, so that our entire fabric of our community can thrive.
Thank you, Tawanna. Henry?
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for allowing me to be on this panel. It's an honor. And I have to say, you know, as a former banker and somebody that's been in the real estate business for 20 plus years, it's exciting to be a part of this panel and have this discussion on a larger scale, because I feel like what we do at PPL, Project for Pride in Living, is really take people to places that they maybe feel a little uncomfortable. And homeownership can be uncomfortable for people. And when you always have been a renter, you don't think that you can be a homeowner. So that's kind of my job, is to take you from A to Z, get you ready for homeownership, but not just for homeownership, but to have a better financial understanding of how finances work, from budgeting to paying bills on time, to making sure that you're saving. You know, I challenge a lot of people I first worked with to learn the rule of 72, to know how your money will double over time. What do you have to do to make sure that when you're 30, you have enough money to retire at 65 or 70? Homeownership is one way to get there. And if you haven't learned about homeownership, the question is, when do you learn about homeownership? So I take pride in my job at PPL. Being a former banker, I look at what the banks are going to look at when you go into their branch to get approval. And a lot of times, some people will go to a branch, but if I don't see somebody that looks like me, that may make me a little uncomfortable. Do I really want to sit down and share all my information with somebody regarding my taxes, my W-2s, my credit, what's in my bank account, what's not in my bank account? And if you happen to take your child with you, how does that make them feel if mom or dad is denied a loan on the spot? So those are things we really try to make sure that we're working on at PPL. And I'm looking forward to discussing this further as part of my question. But this is just exciting today. Even under COVID, we could not stop this conversation from happening. So that within itself is very powerful, that all of us are coming together today to really understand, why do we have this disparity gap? You know, how do we fix it? And moving forward, what can we all do different that we weren't doing last week or 2 years ago it's very interesting. I used to be on the board for Habitat Minnesota, and I can see all the great work that's being done, but I'm in the trenches. If you're not in those trenches and you live outside of the trenches, how can you see that the work is being done? So that's why events like today are very, very much needed, because it allows other people to see what's going on, and then they can pass that knowledge on to somebody else. So I'm honored to be a part of this panel, and I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you, Henry. Well, now that we know a bit about each of you, I would love for us to dig in a little bit further. So, Kirsten, we're going to start with you. As you shared, the Mapping Prejudice Project has been working on this topic, and hearing the 25,000 number was a bit eye-opening for me, even though we're facilitating this conversation today. So, you know, as we center inequities in homeownership and the longstanding history as part of today's conversation, what do you think we can learn from our community's history in redlining and these other discriminatory practices as we think about a path forward?
Yeah, well, that is the million-dollar question, right? So our work is doing a lot of different things. One is this map that we're creating with community members is giving light to some central myths that have organized our thinking about housing in Minnesota. One is that we've been taught collectively that Minnesota never had any kind of formal segregation, that these racial disparities that we have come out of some kind of natural order or personal choices. That's just not true. The covenants that we study are illegal today. They've been illegal since 1968. They were made illegal through a series of court decisions and laws. But of course, we're still living with the legacies of these practices. As you all know, and as I've already mentioned, covenants were able to transform, in the case of Minneapolis, a city that was racially mixed into a very segregated city. And then once those demographic patterns were in place, once those neighborhoods were segregated, those patterns have stayed in place. The neighborhoods that were gated through covenants are still the whitest parts of the Twin Cities today. And then the neighborhoods that were not gated with covenants, they were redlined. That's the federal policy that declared neighborhoods that were racially mixed to be hazardous for capital, hazardous for investment. So that choked off capital to those areas. So of course, covenants combined with redlining, those two policies in particular, to really depress homeownership rates for people of color, especially for Black people. And that's the root of the situation that we have today, where we have one of the highest homeownership disparity rates, racial homeownership disparity rates in the country. So why is this history important? It's important for us to understand why it seems to be the same group of people who are so vulnerable to housing insecurity. It's not an accident, it's structural. The system was built to keep Black and brown people from owning property. It was designed to keep Black and brown people out of places that were seen as most desirable. And of course, the time has come to make, it's past come to make amends for this. We need to level the playing field. We need to give everyone access. That's why the work of Habitat is so important. So it's important for everyone to understand that the past doesn't go away, that we're all encumbered by this past. So that's the first thing, having a new awareness of this history. And I think that's empowering in a lot of ways. First of all, having this understanding, we understand if we made this, we can unmake this, right? I hope that gives people hope to some degree. And it also emphasizes that it has to be that racial equity, not just equality of opportunity, has to be central to any kind of housing justice policy going forward. That's because housing discrimination, racial discrimination, has been central to housing practices in the past. So really centering the question of racial equity in every kind of conversation around housing is really important. I hope that this work will help to fuel a lot of things. It will help to fuel a sense of righteous outrage. I hope it will fuel a sense of moral urgency for people. And I also hope it will give people hope. It will give people hope that this injustice can be addressed, that there's nothing natural about the situation that we find ourselves in today. So with that, I'm sure we're going to have a lot of conversation around this topic.
Well, thank you, Kirsten. That's an excellent segue into the next question. Tawanna, having heard what Kirsten just shared, and I took a couple of notes, maybe you noticed, but her comment about centering racial equity in this work, from what I understand about the work that you're doing at the center, that's exactly the point. So could you share with us a little bit about how the center is thinking about connecting equitable access to affordable homeownership and an inclusive economy going forward?
Absolutely. Well, first, I just have to give a shout out to Kirsten. I love that point, and it's one that we echo quite a bit, that if we created this, we can undo it, right? Anything that we've done, we can undo. And so that's exactly right. And it's one of the things that we start with is first supporting employers and creating benefits around homeownership and addressing racial equity in that. And so often employers have really great benefits for people who transfer into a community. I'm a trailing spouse. I've benefited for that throughout my entire marriage, or 23, 24 years across the country. But when we think about middle income workers or workers who are incumbent workers, we just don't think about that as employers. And so we remind employers that you absolutely can create benefits that can help your workers and employees be able to move into homeownership. And it's not a charity thing. It's one of the best things that you can do to be able to stabilize your workforce and ensure that when people are at work, they are fully focused on being able to thrive in that workplace and give it all that they've got, which is going to ensure your bottom line. So this isn't just a handout, but being able to think about that and being able to think about thriving and stable renters as well, because that's one of the things that's a good step on the pathway to homeownership. And so being able to do that, but also doing that again with that lens for racial equity. So being able to target some of those benefits, particularly when we're thinking about populations. And we do that at the center by helping employers understand who's your current workforce. How much do you know about your current workforce and their housing stability? How much do you know about whether or not you've had people who are housing secure or housing insecure? And we do that through a racial equity dividends assessment that we offer all of our customers and clients at the center as we work with employers, again, both in the public and private sector. We also support banks in equipping them to address what we see as racism still taking place, particularly among middle income borrowers in the workplace. If you were to look at our indicators for an inclusive regional economy, you'll see that even for earners who are earning $100,000 in the Minneapolis-St. Paul market, we still see disparate impacts when it comes to home mortgage approvals and denials. And so we work with banks to understand what's happening inside your industry, what's happening inside your bank when it comes to those mortgage approvals, and how do you ensure that you undo that racism that may be taking place inside your industry. And again, do that root cause analysis about how we see people and what causes us to make those subjective assumptions about whether or not they're going to have an ability to thrive inside that mortgage, and how we go beyond just diversity and inclusion training to really rooting out the racism that has been adapted inside our mindsets, adapted inside those systems of screening into mortgages, and really putting things back into our systems that allow us to be intentional about equity and inclusion to get the results that we ultimately desire.
Great, thank you. Henry, having heard what Tawanna just shared about their work with the mortgage industry and as a leading practitioner in this space, based on your experience working directly with households striving to become homeowners, or even kind of shifting their mindset about homeownership and its attainability, what are some of the common barriers you see households facing?
Well, I think it goes to what both panelists have said so far. If you grew up and your great grandmother or your grandparents were not homeowners because they were never given the chance to be a homeowner, that's going to impact you. So we got to go back those 50 some years when these covenants were in place 60, 70, 80 years ago, that people of color weren't even given the option to buy or even live in certain neighborhoods. So one thing I also challenge people today that's listening is, let's stop using the word hood. Okay, we live in neighborhoods. We don't live in hoods. We live in neighborhoods. And what happens sometimes is we devalue areas of the community by putting a negative spin on that neighborhood, by using just certain words. And then if I didn't have the ability to walk into the bank and sit down with a mortgage lender that looks like me, or even go to the bank to deposit my paycheck that I worked hard for, that's another barrier, because now I don't have a banking relationship. So if your mother and father, your grandparents didn't truly have a true banking relationship, you as a young adult don't really believe in the banking system. So you may not even have credit when you turn 18. You try to move out on your own, you don't have any established credit as a young adult, because you don't understand that going to the local corner store and having layaway or buying your groceries via a system that's just considered a neighborhood or system where you get paid on Friday, but you can pick your groceries up on Wednesday, that's not credit. That's credit in the neighborhood, but that's not credit that a lending institution is going to look at in order to give you money. So right there, we got to make sure we're educating our youth, young adults, of really what credit is. How does credit work? Why is it important to have certain trade lines? Why is it important to make sure that when we do get credit, we pay our bills on time? As I mentioned earlier, the rule of 72. Why is it important to save money? Why is it important to have that relationship with a bank where you can have direct deposit of your paycheck? Because I always tell people it's a challenge. If you cash your check on Friday, how do you really manage your money for the next 2 weeks until you get paid again if it's in your pocket or if it's sitting in your dresser at home? That's a very, to me, hard way to manage your money. It can be done, but if you have direct deposit and you can kind of watch your money as you spend it, because you can see the debits or credits in your bank account, that makes a difference. But it's also, I challenge everybody on this call today, what can we do better to make sure we educate people about home ownership, and that it is possible for everybody, no matter what nationality you are, especially households of color. And the reason I say that is, right now I'm in my basement doing this call. My wife is at work in the dining room, and my daughter is in 9th grade at this time right now on our 2nd floor. By having a house, that's allowing us to do 3 separate things at one time, and we're not disturbing each other. Where if we did not have a home, this would be maybe hard for me to conduct today, because we would all be on top of each other. So I think it's very important that we understand why homeownership is important. One, you have flexibility. You can do whatever you want with your house. If you own that house, you can paint the walls whatever color you want to do. You can build yourself a deck. You can tear down your garage, build yourself a bigger garage if that's what you choose fit to do. But it also helps you build wealth. Over a long time, it helps you build wealth. I'm very proud to say that my parents have been homeowners since 1963. One way I could go to college was my father and mother took out an equity line and assisted me in going to college. So I had no student loans when I came out of college. I went to a historically Black college in Atlanta, Georgia, got my degree. That put me ahead of a lot of my friends that I grew up with. So when I get my first job, I'm not worried about paying back student loans. I'm worried about saving. I'm worried about, hey, how can I maybe buy that house? How can I buy a car? So just having that flexibility goes a long way for people. If you ever needed to do something in the future to help your child out, pay for a wedding, pay for college, anything, you can use your home as collateral if it's needed. Not something we always suggest, but that ability to pass on wealth through home ownership, may it be a sale, it be that your parents decide, you know what, we're going to move, we're going to downsize, we're going to move to Florida, we're tired of this Minnesota snow, but we're going to let you move in this house, and you are no longer a renter, you are now a homeowner. They transfer the title to you. That's powerful. But if you've never had that chance, then you're always playing catch up. And I think that's what's happened, unfortunately, to a lot of households of color, especially the African-American community in Minnesota, is we have been playing catch up for a very, very long time. And now the idea is let's let everybody know that, hey, you can do this through the Homeownership Alliance, lenders, the nonprofits such as PPL. There's a network of people out here trying to help you make sure. I tell people one of my favorite movies is The Wiz, right? So when we put you on that yellow brick road, when you get to Oz, there will be a house there for you, but I got to first get you to the yellow brick road. If I never get you there, then it's hard for me to assist you. So I tell people, don't let anybody discourage you from home ownership. sit down for a professional and find out what steps you need to take. Because some people are very closer. They're close to what they need to do. They just never sat down and talked to anybody. So that's a barrier right there. The education piece is key. Make sure that you're sitting down with somebody that can tell you what steps you need to take to get to home ownership. If you're working, that's a positive. If you have credit, that's a positive. If you have put some money away, that's a positive. Well, if you never ask, you just think, oh, you know, I need 20% down, but you may not need 20% down. That's what's so lovely again about even Habitat's programs. You don't need a full 20% down to buy a house. We would like for you to have a certain credit score, but are you monitoring your credit? When was the last time you had somebody really look at your credit? I tell people that come and see me, this is kind of like going to the doctor for the first time. I'm just here to do, we're going to run some tests on you today. It's kind of like getting your vitals when you go to the doctor for the first time. Let's look at what your financial vitals look like. So then we know how to proceed and how we can make sure that you're a successful homeowner. And you can also plan a future for your children and your great grandchildren. That's what I'm trying to help you create, is long-term wealth. So I mean, I think if we start with that conversation of there are no barriers, if you ask questions, then we can deal with those barriers. But if you don't ask the question, there will always be barriers.
Thank you, Henry. Habitat and other homeownership advocates have been talking about the connection to homeownership as a key strategy for building wealth. And thank you for reminding us about that key goal associated with affordable homeownership. And it's a great transition to a question for Natosha. Many of you know that Habitat has been working in the affordable homeownership and housing field since 1976 with the idea that everyone should have access equitably to owning a home. And as Natosha, you mentioned earlier, we most recently launched the Cost of Home campaign with the ambitious goal of improving housing affordability for 10 million people, with an emphasis of that advocacy work on racial equity. Considering what we've heard from the panelists today, what are some promising practices that you've seen around the nation that we could explore and consider here in Minnesota to support that goal?
Well, first of all, this is an awesome panel. I mean, the information, there's so many connections of the dots throughout this conversation. I just to kind of one connecting dot moment that I think in many instances undergirds a lot of the work of our campaign is the fact that, and Henry mentioned this, Kirsten talked about it, and Tawanna also touched on it, this issue of wealth development, right? And the long-term, you know, there was an article in the Washington Post in June of this year entitled "The Black-White Economic Divide is as Wide as It Was in 1968." And this particular data point really stood out to me. It said, as of 2016, the most recent year for which this data is available, you would have to combine the net worth of 11.5 Black households to get the net worth of a typical US white household. 11.5 Black households to equal 1. Granted, everyone has different data points and different sources, but I've seen multiple varieties of these different data points, and they're all pretty much in the same ballpark. It also translates into the typical middle-class Black household has $13,000 in wealth versus $150,000 for the median white household. And a lot of that is directly connected to the opportunities that were afforded to white families in the beginning, really in the 30s, with the FHA policies that began to intentionally subsidize a white middle class in the United States. In the 1940s and the 1950s, we even see how it played out with the vets that came back from World War II with the GI Bill, providing home ownership opportunities to white vets that came back, opportunities to access housing and access credit with low to no down payment assistance, low to no interest rates, in a low cost mortgage in an appreciating neighborhood. That was not offered to Black vets coming back through the GI Bill. There was an intentional effort by law, and I love what Kirsten brought up, the point that in Minnesota, for instance, just like in Cleveland, just like in parts of Atlanta, just like in places that were not in the segregated South, in Richmond, California, where those cities were already integrated, legal policy legislation came in place and legislated segregation. Constitutional violation, when you really look at it from a legal perspective. So when we're looking at this conversation on redressing this history, we cannot do so without acknowledging the context in which we're operating. So now Henry is providing help and developing a pipeline with those folks who are 2 and 3 generations from those who were either dispossessed of their housing option and their opportunity to build wealth because a highway needed to be built through their old neighborhood, right? Or those who did not have the benefit of understanding banking relationships and access to capital, those who did not have families who were able to refi 5, 6, and 7 times to pay for college, to pay for healthcare, to pay for the expenses related to a job loss. So we're now in the midst of a COVID pandemic where those who were already vulnerable are even more vulnerable. So now to get to answer your question, Kristen, I wasn't ignoring it, but I think it's so important that we understand, even with our idealistic vision of a world where everyone deserves a decent place to call home, right? And I loved Henry's recalling of The Wiz, right? Because one of the songs that Stephanie Mills made popular in The Wiz is, when I think of home, I think of a place where there's love and affection. Home right now, in this moment where we have to stay at home and shelter in place, it means so much more, obviously, right, than 4 walls and a good investment. It's an opportunity for people to restart, to have safety, to have healthcare, right? We believe in the Habitat Network, and Dr. Megan Sandell really made this very popular, and she's a member of our advocacy campaign cabinet, that housing is a vaccine. There are interrelated components of home and housing, the relationship between housing and health, the relationship between housing and education, the relationship between housing and wealth creation. The Cost of Home campaign takes all of that into consideration, working through the network of Habitat, because truly it's not HFHI that's getting all of this done, it's our affiliates and all of our various nooks and crannies of this country. And some of the policy pushes and efforts that are going on around the country include things like minimizing the damage and the compounding effect of COVID-19 for Black and brown households. That means looking to be a part of, advocate for, and speak up for remedying racial housing disparities by preventing eviction and foreclosure for renters and homeowners who are vulnerable in this moment, some who are essential workers that are under threat of losing their housing, losing their apartments, or losing their homes. So it's important to not only prevent eviction and foreclosure, but then once any of those remedies are put in place, how are we going to then help renters and homeowners get caught up on missed payments? Begin looking for policy solutions in that vein. And so we have affiliates that are working on policy solutions like that. Also, increasing opportunities for Black home ownership. Our campaign is focused on the ecosystem of housing. We're looking at renters, and we're also looking at homeowners. But one of the essential components, obviously, is increasing opportunities for home ownership for those families and people who want to take on the responsibility of home ownership. So increasing access to down payment assistance, increasing access to affordable credit options. These are not new. We did this before in the 50s when we subsidized the creation of the white middle class. Now, what does it look like to subsidize the creation of a new middle class in this country, where we see that the middle class is hit with challenge after challenge? So when we really begin to advocate for policies, legislative options, call senators, call state reps, work at the state level, work at the local level, work at the federal level. We want to also invest in affordable home ownership. So even with down payment assistance is available, unaffordable home prices remain a major obstacle to home ownership in many communities. So that includes looking at expanding the federal home program, federal self-help home ownership opportunity program, and other complementary and local initiatives and investments that are doing something similar. Providing increased resources for community development financial institutions that are actually lending to entities that are providing affordable home ownership options. And then also retargeting the mortgage interest deduction to make it more equitable. There are many aspects. Then of course you've got inclusionary zoning policies that are looking at accessory dwelling units and decreasing the lot sizes and the requirements of lot sizes in some of these areas to allow for there to be somewhat more dense neighborhoods and communities, but doing it in such a way that we're making an investment in these areas, not only with housing, but we're partnering because of the intersectionality of housing with businesses to draw resources to our place-based component. Inclusionary zoning is one option. But there, it doesn't mean that there's obviously this controversy about forced integration again. Some people want to stay where they are, but they want resources where they are. They want a coffee shop. They want a viable, organic grocery store in their area. I live in a part of Atlanta that I would think is a wonderful community, but there are no organic grocery store options south of a certain highway, right? Many of our neighborhoods in our cities are segregated by highways. And here's the thing that I think is so important, and I loved Kirsten's continued push on, in the midst of these overwhelming odds and overwhelming challenges, we've got to hold on to hope. We've got to continue to remember that no matter what, this has been done before. It's not new. My connection to Minnesota is my mother is white German descent from New Prague, Minnesota, went to college in Winona, Minnesota, and in 1968 was part of a group of white women that came to Spelman College in Atlanta, historically Black college and university, as an effort and an intentional effort to cross divides, to cross differences, to say that, you know what, we are more alike than unalike. When we begin to do this work, when we begin to provide an equity lens to housing, we are making a very strong statement that we believe in neighboring. There's all the NIMBYism out there. There's all of this, I don't want that in my neighborhood. I want my suburb to stay safe. We have got to be on the leading edge as the now generation, whatever your age is. I'm calling us all the now generation, to create a different narrative and framework that dictates, that pushes the conversation, that pushes the lens of equity and how we call communities, community, neighbors, neighbors, and begin to really push this as a movement. This is not a moment. This is not going away. We've got to take advantage of this moment that seems so negative and overwhelming and flip it into an opportunity for transformation. And I'm so excited about the work that Henry, that Kirsten, that Tawanna, that Habitat Minnesota, is that we're engaging in, and we're digging deep. And you know, this conversation on race, it's always so fascinating because no one wanted to talk about it, and yet it influences almost every aspect of our lives. How about we begin realizing this is our conversation? The conversation on race is not my conversation as a Black woman. It's not Henry's conversation as a Black man. It's just as much Kirsten's conversation and Kristen's conversation. It is all of our conversation. This is the bag of goods we were all handed. Let's make something out of it. So that's the role that I think we play today. That's how I think we move forward. That's the passion and the energy and the drive we have to have. Because just like Kirsten has mentioned it, Tawanna's mentioned it, we know much thought, work, and strategy went into creating the situation and the bag of goods we're handed. We're smarter than this. We're more strategic than this to become so overwhelmed by what we're dealing with. We have got to do better. And I truly believe that all of these 133 people that are on are committed to doing better. Let's share our best practices as we're doing now. Let's push against the grain. And in the midst of this moment, this pandemic, this politically divisive moment, let's not allow partisanship to divide us. Let's see this as an opportunity to find ways to solve this problem.
Kirsten, it looked like you wanted to jump in and say something. I was, while you're collecting your thoughts, I was wishing we were all in person because I think we all may have stood up and cheered with your comments, Natosha. So thank you for the,
I feel like in the Zoom world, I just do this like vigorous nodding, and I'm not sure. I was so excited by and energized by what you were saying, and just reiterate that we've done this before. You know, so we've had other moments of crisis in our country, and actually the federal government, as Natosha already explained, stepped in the 1930s and created a whole raft of new programs to shore up homeownership. And this in turn led to the largest expansion of the middle class in American history. Of course, the tragedy of that is it was for white people exclusively. So 98% of the FHA loans that were extended between the beginning of the FHA and 1968 were given to white people. You know, 98%. So that's a pretty, but at the same time, even, you know, but we know that those types of programs do work to expand the middle class, to give people economic stability. So again, I just want to reiterate that we can do this. We actually have a lot of the tools already. We know what we need to do. And the challenge, I think, before all of us today is to create the political will that we need to bring the resources to do this kind of work that everyone's already, that people are already doing in the trenches. And yes, to name race, to name racism, not to pretend that racism is going to go away if we just ignore it. So with that, it was basically a big amen to what Natosha was saying. But
Kristen,
Yeah.
can I add something to what Kristen was saying too? I think it's important. So in this, we've got to pick apart, to your point, Kristen, of trying to be very pragmatic in how we do this, pick apart or find and prioritize what we can focus in on, right? So for instance, many of our affiliates throughout our network and other organizations, not just Habitat, are focusing in on this Black homeownership gap, right? Many of us have mentioned it even on the panel today. So some of the effective ways in which I think folks are going after it is to say, what is that Black homeownership gap? In your city, in your community, what does that equate to? Is it 5,000 homes, 10,000 homes, 11,000 homes? Once you have a goal of understanding what that gap is, what represents, then you have something to go after. So we've got folks that are working on that. They've identified what that gap is and they're going after it, right? It gives you a target.
I was going to say too, if I can add, I think one thing we want to make sure too is that what Natosha was saying is should be no shame with somebody giving you down payment assistance, right? If there is a program out there to help you get into a home, you have to understand that it is not something to be ashamed of. If any organization, city, state agency is able to give you $5,000 to $15,000 to help you buy your house, and you pay that money back when you sell your house or refinance, whichever you do first, you really look at that as a major gift, right? As a way to start building equity. I'll give you a true story. I have a friend of mine that unfortunately father passed away and is trying to sell his house now through an estate situation. And I asked him earlier, I said, would you rather spend $4,000 to make $70,000, or would you rather let the house go in foreclosure? Right? So you can spend $4,000 to make sure this home does not go in foreclosure, but you stand to make $70,000 when the house sells. To me, that's not even a question of what he should do, right? But he's wondering if it's worth it. And I'm in my heart, and so I'm thinking, like, it's not a question of what you should do, because that is your father's legacy. That is what he is trying to leave to you, to make sure you have an asset, and then your children will have an asset, because that $70,000 can turn into $100,000 over the next 15 to 20 years. You can't afford to let his legacy die by not taking care of what you need to take care of with the mortgage company. But to even have that conversation was hurtful to me, because in my mind, it shouldn't even be a question of what should be done.
Yeah, I think it's important, the things that you're elevating for us, Henry, as well as the conversation that I'm reading in the chat, as we all wrestle with, it's easy for us to think about the seats that we sit in. And Henry, you get to work with people who are all in different stages of life, all coming from different backgrounds. You've been a banker as well, so you know what it's like to see somebody different almost every hour who's coming in from a different perspective. For those of us who maybe haven't had that opportunity, it's easy to look at it through the lens that we're in. And yet I also appreciate one of the comments in the chat about, is it right to encourage people to borrow against the home equity that's in their homes? Or to your point of somebody who might say, should I take this assistance in being able to seek a down payment? I think we can't overemphasize enough the wealth that has been extracted out of certain communities and the wealth that has been seeded into other communities. And I want to be very specific, the wealth that has been extracted out of Black and Native communities and the wealth that has been seeded into white communities. When we think about how to then advise those communities, it's just, there's no way to do that if you have not been in one of those communities, or if you have not studied the history of race and economics in these communities. And so while certainly I don't think the advice that has been given across this particular webinar has been to encourage people to find themselves in a place that is going to weaken the fabric of any particular family or our economy, And at the same time, we know that for so many of our Black and brown communities, the only way to have any opportunity to move forward economically, to be able to move forward, whether it's to pursue education or other means of being able to secure housing, has been to be able to use these tools, to be able to use housing to be able to move forward, when often traditional banking has not been a tool or a resource for those same families. And so again, taking knowledge of the history of our country, the history of policies and tools, and until we're able to do what Kirsten encouraged us to earlier and undo the racism that is in these policies in order to create the equity that is necessary, again, not only for communities, but for the very economic fabric of our country, those differences in approach are necessary for families to be able to move forward. They simply are necessary.
Thank you. All of you. Oh, go ahead, Kirsten.
I was going to say, and maybe this is slightly off topic too, but again, like as a historian, I can't resist to interject the fact that this knowledge about the importance of land and homeownership is, I think, in some ways baked into the DNA of Black communities in particular, especially in the aftermath of the Civil War, when you have so many Black families putting a premium on acquiring land. And Black land tenure and home and property ownership actually reached its high point in the United States in 1910. And it's been declining ever since. And it's through these policies. So again, it's some of it is understanding this history and also reclaiming these earlier legacies from elders who understand the importance of home for every aspect of community growth and stability and health. So that's my plug for history yet again.
I love that point, because that's the psychology of housing also, and the psychology of value, and the psychology, behind the notion of ownership and worth is so key. And there is as Henry, I think, has said so well, and Habitat affiliates have worked through this with their homeowners, which is so much a part of our homeowner support work. But that whole kind of the journey from renting to owning, it's a mindset shift that's involved, as well as a practical approach and credit worthiness approach. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Right. I like Tawanna, I want to thank you I didn't see the chat, and for the person that asked the question about the equity. So here's one conversation I have that I feel like when you're sick, where do you go? You typically will go to the doctor. If you have a toothache, you'll go to the dentist. If you have a financial question, where should you go? And I think all the affiliates, all of the nonprofits on the call today that do homeownership counseling, I think that's what we're there for. We're there to help that person that has that question about, should I use my equity or not use my equity? That would be done in a one-on-one session with a counselor to make sure it's affordable for them and it should be done or not done. But my reason for bringing that up is if you never are a homeowner, that's never even an option for you. And I think one of the biggest disappointments I see as a financial coach is the amount of student loan debt people have right now. It's just astronomical of the amount of student loan debt people have that even goes into default, and that can hurt you for years to come, may it be from buying a car, credit cards, home ownership. That if you have a low credit score, I still may give you a car loan, but if I'm paying 18% and everybody else is paying 5%, I'm paying 3 times as much for that same vehicle. And if my credit card rates are at 22% and you're paying 6%, that eventually is going to catch up with me. It's just a domino effect. It's just a matter of time before everything I do in my life is so much more expensive that when do I just give up and say, you know what, homeownership isn't for me. It's not meant to be. Wealth isn't for me. And I just kind of go in this bad space. And that's what we're trying to avoid people from going into, is that bad space. I'll say this, equity is something that we should treasure, and it's like gold. We don't want to just give it away. But if it can be used, it's like, what was big in Black Panther? What did they have in Black Panther? That's what your equity is in your house, that if you use it the right way, that is a resource that can do many, many things over the life of the time you've had your house, may it be 25 years, 30 years. So no, I definitely understand what their comment was, but we want to make sure we're educating our participants on how to best use their resources. And that's where I would come in, or anybody on this call that works with people one-on-one, that's where they would come in and really make sure that that situation is best. Now, are there some very shady people out there? Yes. And that's what we're trying to avoid, the community not to go to those places, because that's how that can happen.
Thanks. Oh, go ahead, Kirsten. Looks like you want to jump in.
Well, I was just going to say, and if you're a renter, you never have that option, right? I mean, it is a whole, having that home equity as an insurance policy, basically. And yes, you don't want to draw on it all the time, but if you never have that, then that's just you never have that option. So I'm sure there are other people who can speak more than I can to this topic, but.
Kristen, can I be the annoying lawyer on this one? And that is just to say this: we're using the term equity in two different ways. I just want to make sure we all are hearing that. So, I mean, but they're very related, and they're pretty synonymous in some ways in which we can talk about it. So, Henry, you were just speaking of equity as money, access to capital. When we talk about equity in kind of the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, yes, that equity is somewhere down the line, access to capital, but we're also talking about a power dynamic in our structures. The idea that it's a hand up, not a handout. Equity pulls you up. It kind of gives you a lift. It's somewhat different from equality in that the door is open, and equality, the door is open for everyone. The issue is that not everyone can get there at the same time because you started at a different starting point, right? So equity brings us to the same starting point and gives us access and equality. I think it's interesting in this conversation too, is that I heard someone say recently that for so long through the civil rights movement and such, we were pushing for equality. African Americans and people that have been dispossessed were fighting for equality while white folks were getting equity, capital, access to it, the ability to build wealth, right? Now we're saying, let's have equity with access to equity, right? Let's now all begin to really even the starting point and to line us up. And that's the great work, I think, Henry, that you and Tawanna are doing in your spheres.
Thanks for taking the minute to clarify that. I noticed a quick shift in language there too, so I'm thankful you jumped right in. And I think I want to be thoughtful that we do have a couple of questions in the chat box. And so our audience members, if you have a question rolling around in your mind, we're going to get to questions here in just a couple of minutes. But I also want to recognize that I know we have some local elected officials at our state level, as well as local levels, and candidates participating in today's call. And so as we're having this conversation, we've talked a lot about how many of us are working towards solutions. We know that we have a housing crisis, lots of great dialogue today. I'm interested in hearing a little bit from each of you about what are some solutions that you'd like to see our community and elected leaders support, and how should candidates running for office today be thinking about this in their campaigns? The election's right around the corner, and we have an opportunity here to talk about how this is really a nonpartisan conversation, and we could be really working together to advance this. So look forward to your thoughts on that. Any of you can jump in.
I think earlier Natosha spoke about the need that several communities are looking at, where we're actually measuring specifically what is the amount of housing that's necessary, what is the homeownership gap, et cetera, and then zooming in with very targeted solutions. And I think this is an opportunity that elected leaders have, is to be very targeted in our solutions. And so it's one thing to elevate the amount of money that you're going to put toward new housing development, a new building of construction, right? It's one thing to say, this is the amount of dollars that I'm going to put toward it. It's another thing to make sure that voters understand what is that going to do to the gap that we have, and to be very targeted in that, and then to come back and to report it. And we're at the stage right now where we need a significant level of accountability in understanding what's the gap and what are we doing to close that gap. We also need intersectional solutions. So right now, given the significant gaps that we have both in income in our region and across the state and across the country for that matter, and the gaps that we have then in housing affordability and accessibility, all of those things are very inextricably linked. In a place where we have more than 50% of African Americans who have been unemployed since March, and that continues, we have 40% of African American owned businesses that are not expected to return. We have 40% of Native Americans who have filed for unemployment since March. Those things are very linked. Then when we look at housing, we look at our education crisis, right? All of these things are very linked. You can't look at any of them in silos. That means our deployment of dollars and resources must also be very much linked. We can no longer afford for our commissioners, our departments, to be then deploying their budgets and their values then in siloed ways, but we must start to see strategies and deployments of policies and solutions and dollars that are very intersectional. And we've got smart people in these departments. This is very much possible, but it's not possible if we continue to do things the way that we've done them in the past. We also need to see communities driving solutions, not just having a couple of seats at tables and round tables and committees, but actually driving solutions. We saw this come forward with the deployment of our CARES Act dollars, where we saw policymakers having a little more freedom with the resources that they could deploy. We saw many more dollars flowing directly to organizations led by our Black, Indigenous, and communities of color, because they did not have the standard restrictions that federal dollars typically come with. And that, I believe, based on the partnerships that we're seeing with our public sector, is going to result in some accelerated results. However, those are short-term dollars. We need our policymakers committed to freeing themselves from the restrictions they typically operate with when it comes to the deployment of housing dollars, workforce dollars, economic development dollars in the next section and the one after that, because we will not undo 400 years of racism in a couple of months, in 6 months and the next 6 months after that. But it's going to take multi-generational solutions in order to undo multi-generational harm. And so seeing policy leaders who are willing to work hand in hand with community, hand in hand with our business sector and philanthropy, to really be intentional about investing in those solutions that come closest to home, being intentional about going population by population, and trusting the wisdom that comes from communities. I appreciated the notion that our fellow panelists have offered earlier about the values that come from having a home, of owning a home, and that those values may look different population by population, and yet they're just as important. And that requires us also investing a bit differently, investing in policy solutions a bit differently. And those leaders who are willing to do that, who don't see it as a risk so much as an opportunity to really grow our economy, to change the very fabric of the way that we operate, are going to be those who I think find success much longer than an election cycle.
I second. I would stand up and cheer if I were in person on that one. And the only thing I would add to in this, and I'm sort of hinted to it, is this notion, and call me crazy, but I think it's crazy that housing is a partisan issue. When you think about the building blocks of our country, housing and home ownership and access to safe home and shelter, it seems like it should just be such essential to human rights, to the American way. I mean, when we look back at our founding documents, we can find example after example. So one of the things I would encourage, and I don't think what I'm saying is anything new, but I would encourage our legislators, work across the aisles. Like this is something that we need buy-in from both sides of the aisle. Find entry points that pull your constituency along. If your issue is education, show its intersection to housing. If your entry point is protecting vulnerable children, show its intersection to housing. Find ways to pull your constituencies and your support into this very crucial issue that needs solution, that's going to require buy-in from both sides of the aisle. I mean, I don't know enough about Minnesota politics, but I know enough about many of the other jurisdictions around this country where there's such a divide politically. We've got to find a way to work together. And I think as constituents of these legislators, we must insist that. We must insist that our representatives push forward issues like housing and education for the good of our community, regardless of our partisan leanings. And I think We need to bring civility back to this conversation.
I'm from a household of educators, so I think one thing we can do is put more money into education at all levels, elementary school, junior high school, college, and then also education for organizations that are trying to teach the home stretch, the frameworks. I think one thing I still struggle with, what is affordable housing? What is affordable housing? I think it looks different for everybody. And one thing Tawanna mentioned, I think we also need to have different resources for somebody that is at a different AMI versus somebody else. Sometimes I feel like we limit the amount of money that somebody can get to get into a house, but they already have a proven track record of paying a higher amount in rent. Even though it may look funny on paper, their ratios may look a little funny, but they've been struggling for the last 5 to 10 years to pay this high number for rent. And we can lower that number by getting them into a house that's long-term. Even though the ratio is going to be a little bit out of line, they have that proven track record. I think we need to also look at that. But if they had additional dollars that they could get, that may make that burden less for them, and also may make the lender feel more comfortable with giving them a chance to show that they can be a successful homeowner. But education is key. I struggle with young adults not really understanding how credit really can impact the rest of their life. I struggle with, again, the word affordability. What's affordable? I see some single mothers that I work with make wonders out of some money, right? And it amazes me that they can't get the opportunity to be a homeowner because they don't fit this norm. They don't fit this normal buyer, or somebody won't give them a chance. And it's sad. That needs to change. And I think we need to do a better job of being present in the community. We need to be present. The lenders, the realtors, everybody in this industry needs to be present. So I grew up in a neighborhood in South Minneapolis where you respected your coaches, you respected your teachers, you knew they were people from the community, and you did not fear, or you knew if you did something wrong 5 blocks away from your house, that somebody in that neighborhood could call your mother and father and tell them, like, Henry was down here, he was doing. That was a community. I want us to see us get back to those days of being a community and really having the blessing from the top down, and not say, well, yeah, they don't really need this money over here, we're going to put the money over there. I think that's, if we can put the money back in the community the way it should be spent and really bring everybody together. I asked everybody on this, how many times do you participate in National Night Out? Do you really know your neighbors? Do you know your community? That would be a challenge to me. Do you really, really, not like hi, but do you really know your neighbors and your community?
Thanks. Before I pivot to a question in the chat box, Kirsten, is there anything you'd like to add on messages for candidates or local electeds?
Yeah, I love the message that that housing should be the ultimate unifying issue. That it should be something that we can, because we know it's at the foundation of everything. And also we have a long track record in this country of shoring up homeownership with that understanding. So again, here's where I hope history can help, that we've done this before for white people. So, so we know that these strategies can work. But how does it look different when we actually open this opportunity for everyone?
Thank you. All right. Well, there have been some good notes here in the chat box, and I see a couple of you popped in to provide comment based on some of the things in here. We have just a couple of minutes, so I think I'm gonna share this one from one of our Habitat executive directors. He says, I'm Nathan Thompson, an executive director for North St. Louis County Habitat in Virginia, Minnesota. He says, hi to Henry. And he's wondering if the panelists could share an insight into how racial inequities in homeownership impact rural communities differently than urban communities.
So I think one of the ways that we've seen this in particular, both as a rural kid from another state and as more rural communities invite us out for support, is the ability to look at how we marry the need for housing, both, again, affordable and accessible housing as it relates to employers and employment. And so really, I think that we see the need is both very similar as we see here in an urban community, but a need for more targeting, right, in the relationship. So I mentioned earlier in my, I think, earliest remarks, the tools that we provide for employers to be thinking very intentionally about how to understand their own workforce and the needs and resources that employees may need, being able to understand where employees may be housing secure or insecure, and be very targeted with benefits and resources for employees that ensure that people move from being stably rentally secure into being able to secure home ownership. And so I think working with and partnering with employers is one of the fastest ways of directly closing both home ownership gaps and housing affordability and accessibility gaps in a rural community, not unlike challenges and opportunities that we may have in an urban metro, where often you have core groups of communities of color in one urban community, but you may have employment located in first and second or even third ring suburbs, and have significant gaps in transportation and other needs between both those job hubs and centers and then the workforce housing that's available, and a need to be able to close those gaps.
Thanks, Tawanna. Other comments?
I think one thing that I have heard from people when I start talking about this history is a lot of people assume in rural communities that this whole question of discriminatory housing practices was just an urban issue, and that actually there is no racism in housing is not an issue outside of the big urban centers. And what we found is in our just very preliminary research is the opposite, that it's actually more profound in these smaller communities. And so, to me, that prompts the what's the action today? It means that our racial equity lens, I think, has to be even sharper in rural, making interventions in rural communities as urban communities. So I just want to caution people against thinking that there is some kind of divide here, that this is just an urban problem and not a rural problem as well.
Thank you. Natosha?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it obviously depends on where the rural communities are located, but you've also got homestead property concerns, and in certain situations, you've got folks in rural communities who may be land rich but money poor, and may not have as strong of a track record to be credit worthy. And so even you're evaluating the ability to pay. If you're dealing with a financing or a mortgage situation, you may have to consider, other factors as you are working with them to develop their acumen and set them up for success for a long-term mortgage and long-term contract with respect to that mortgage. So there are just some different aspects that you have to look at oftentimes. In some situations, as a home builder developer, you're building the home, they may own the land, but you've got to obviously do very detailed title work to ensure that they own the land free and clear, that it's marketable title. And then, perhaps there are some other aspects of your financing structure that you would be willing to use and be flexible. So.
Thank you. Henry, before I pivot to the final question of the day, do you want to add any comment on that question?
Yeah, I think, again, I think jobs, are they out there? I do think there is fear, I would say, from people of color, especially African Americans. If I move to a rural part of the state and there's not a lot of representation of African Americans, how will I be treated? So I think that's a fear there as well. And, where is my network? Where's my connections? Am I going to move 2 hours away, but all of my family lives in the inner city or a different part of the state? And that's kind of my network. That's my part-time daycare. That's the person that can help me if I get into trouble. That fear of leaving that is real. And that is going to scare a lot of people, even though they may get the job and they may have a better chance of survival in that rural area. If you've never been there, I'll ask you guys this: if you probably pulled a lot of your African American friends, how many African Americans have actually went camping and camped outdoors, not in a camper, but outdoors with a tent? That will answer why some people, they can't even see rural Minnesota. They just, hey, you know what? If it ain't got street lights to it, I'm not going. Same way with swimming. So those are real barriers that African Americans face on a day-to-day basis. So I may be able to go work at this plant 2 hours away from the city, but if I don't feel comfortable, I'm never even going to get on that opportunity. I'm going to cut it short. So that's something you're dealing with as well too. You're dealing with years of fear of not living in a city area, urban thriving community, which is kind of sad to say, but that's reality.
Thanks, Henry. I think that connects well with what Tawanna was saying earlier about kind of creating an inclusive economy and how that all fits together. There are some really great dot connectors, as Natosha was sharing at the beginning of this panel, about how this is all connected. And I'm going to close us out with one final question, and it's kind of a doozy, so you'll have to try and do your best to be a little bit brief. But what is one thing that each of us, the 130 some folks who are on the call today, can do to impact ending racial inequities in homeownership? As Natosha shared earlier, I think we all believe that we're all here and committed to do something and do better. So welcome your quick tips on one thing we can do today.
Can I start? Because I'm not the policymaker in the group, so I can be the most vague. And then you all can actually. So I would just urge all of you to remember your history to start with. Really educate yourself about history, and then use it to build political will. Tell your friends, tell your family members, tell your elected officials what you know about how we got to the place that we are today, and then vote. So I think those are my really important, vote with the understanding that that structural racism is baked into every aspect of our communities, every policy, every institution in our society, and that this is a marathon that we're committing to in terms of a more equitable future.
I could jump in here. Oh, go ahead, Tawanna. I'm sorry, I didn't see anyone else unmute. Go ahead.
The Minnesota Nice, like, it takes over, like, who's gonna go first? Absolutely, I would echo that as well. I also think continuing to drive shared accountability, which for me means whatever your sphere of influence and control is, exercise that to the fullest of authority. Use root cause analysis to ask yourself, are there any examples of systemic racism taking place within my sphere of control? If you're a lender, there likely is. So use that notion that you were just offered of remembering history and saying, where is it still taking place here, and root that out. If you are a realtor, then look for examples where that judgment may be getting in the way of being able to be completely racially equitable and inclusive. If you are just a neighbor, being sure that NIMBYism is not getting in the way of being fully inclusive. If you are an employer and you have opportunities, to be sure that you're paying equitably so that everyone can take full advantage. If you have opportunities to give different benefits, just wherever that you have an opportunity to be as possibly racially inclusive and equitable as you can, exercise that to the fullest of your authority, even if that simply means being a neighbor who takes the opportunity to get to know your neighbors in a deeper, more real way than you do today. Thank you so much.
Natosha, I'll go so you can end. For me, personally, I would say, good trouble. I mean, I think those words are powerful personally. If I feel like if we're not pushing the envelope, we're not doing our jobs. And my wife always says, do you realize how you talk to people sometimes? I'm like, I do. And I talk that way for a reason, because I feel like sometimes you have to challenge people. You have to really push that button. You need to make them feel a little uncomfortable. I feel like if we all are too comfortable, then we're not doing our job. We need to be a little bit uncomfortable. And I think that's what we need to continue to do. We need to continue to have good trouble.
I love all that. If I were in church, I'd be amen and y'all all over the place. But for the secular crew, I think that I'll end with this quote. And I think that this quote actually speaks to all of us in this moment, right? We opened with talking about the multiple pandemics that we're all experiencing. Many of you probably know who Jack Welch is, but he's revered as a strong business strategist. And he said once that if the rate of change on the outside exceeds the rate of change on the inside, the end is near. We need to accept the change before the change is thrust upon us. If people don't perform, they perish. If organizations don't innovate, they become obsolete. If we had not changed, we would have remained in the Stone Age. To cultivate a flexible mindset to embrace change effectively is essential to ensure organizational excellence, community excellence, neighboring excellence. We are in a moment where we must take our fear, put it in our pocket, and keep moving, because change is upon us. And as organizations, as people, as families, as neighborhoods, we are at a time where I believe our choice is to embrace that change and find ways, solutions, and policy changes that allow us to say in 50 years, when we look back, we did something to transform our communities, to transform our families, and to really make the American dream a reality and not just a dream. So I think that we're all primed. We all have been working, toiling. Let's put that work and toil to good. And as we do it, let's hold on to hope, embrace our fear, do it anyway, because so many lives, so many families are depending upon it. Thank you, Cristen, for this panel, and to all of you all for such a great conversation.
Oh, thank you so much to those final comments, Natosha, and to all of you. I think that all of us have our next steps as we end our time together today. Thanks to the Minnesota Homeownership Center for their partnership in pulling this together, as well as Minnesota Housing Finance, and to the team at Habitat Minnesota. And our deepest appreciation to each of the panelists who joined us today. I think that we could have talked for hours today about the connections between our work and the work that we have to move forward to make change in our communities. So I'm deeply thankful for your leadership in our communities and your continued commitment to this work. I hope that you'll all visualize a standing ovation for all of your remarks today. We have much work to do, and doing so in community brings hope, which is where we started today. And as Tawanna shared earlier, home really is truly foundational for all of us. So really just appreciative of the conversation today. So with that, we hope that you'll all get out there and vote and talk with your candidates about the role affordable housing and affordable homeownership has in our state and our communities out there. So be well, take care, and thanks to everybody who joined us today.